So, I think ultimately, I think people have called what's going on cultural genocide. That if um, I think the maximum goal would be to turn Xinjiang into just simply another indistinguishable part of China. The official ideology has always been that China is a unified multinational state. But the emphasis has always been on the unified rather than the multinational. And the multinational basically means that the Uyghurs are Chinese, the same way that Han Chinese are Chinese. And in Mandarin, there is a difference between China and Han. But in actual practical reality, that difference is minimal, if not non-existent.
Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.
Namaste. I, Mithilesh and Sumit, welcome you all to a new episode of the Eastern Report. Today we have noted historian Sri Adeeb Khalid on our show. Today we'll discuss Adeeb Khalid's book, Central Asia, A New History from the Imperial Conquest to the Present. Welcome, Adeeb.
Glad to be here.
Central Asia is often seen as a remote and inaccessible land on the peripheries of modern history, encompassing Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Xinjiang province of China. It in fact stands at the crossroad of world events. Adeeb Khalid provides the first comprehensive history of Central Asia from the mid-18th century to today, shedding light on the historical forces that have shaped the region under imperial and communist rule. The essential history of one of the most diverse and culturally vibrant regions on the planet, this panoramic book reveals how Central Asia has been profoundly shaped by the forces of modernity, from colonialism and social revolution to nationalism, state-led modernization, and social engineering. Adeeb Khalid is Jane and Raphael Bernstein Professor of Asian Studies and History and Director of Middle East Studies at Carleton College. His books include Making Uzbekistan and Islam After Communism. So, what made you write a history book from a Central Asian perspective?
Well, I first became fascinated with this region when I was in high school. And I grew up in Pakistan, in Lahore, and Tashkent is 750 miles from there. But when I was growing up during the Cold War, it might as well have been on a different planet. So there was this idea that here's a land that is so close and yet seems so far, and that historically was very similar, and in the present it's so different. That's what got me interested in Central Asia in the first place. This was the early 1980s. I'm dating myself here. But and then I was lucky enough to be able to actually acquire the skills to be able to do work on Central Asia. And it also helped that the Soviet Union fell apart while I was in the process of getting my PhD. And what that did was to make travel, well, it was not impossible, but much easier, interaction with local scholars much easier, and access to the sources pretty much possible for the first time, when the Soviet archives, which were very systematically collected, but were inaccessible during the Soviet period, they became accessible. So I was there are lots of strokes of luck that came along and lots of coincidences. But in all of that, my interest was always from the beginning to think about Central Asia as a place in its own right. When I started graduate school in the 1980s, the only knowledge about Central Asia, you had some old Orientalist style text-based work for the medieval period. But anything we knew about the present or the recent past was refracted through Sovietology. And in that, Central Asia was seen as a distant, exotic periphery of the Soviet Union. So the idea of learning Central Asian languages and writing something about it that's centered on Central Asia has been with me since I first became interested in that.
So, what challenges did you face while writing the book?
So this book is, I've been at it now for almost 30 years. So this is a synthetic account of, it's an overview, and it's built on the basis of a lot of monographic research that has appeared in the 30 years since the Soviet Union ceased to exist. I don't think I could have written this book 30 years ago, because it is built on if you look at there's no bibliography in the book. It's a guide for further reading. That was the publisher's intention from the beginning, that this should be a generally accessible book, not a purely academic monograph. But if you look at the list of suggested readings at the back, most of the books mentioned there were published after 1992. So in some ways, the big challenge was to be able to tell a single coherent narrative. And here, the most ambitious thing about the book was to include Xinjiang in it. The book would be much easier if I just stuck to the Russian-Soviet side of it. The story is much easier to tell. Xinjiang, well, first of all, because it's part of China, in terms of academic specialization, it's part of a separate historiography and a separate literature. And if you are interested, or those of my friends who specialize on Xinjiang, they go to different programs in graduate school. You end up in Asian studies, and you need to have Chinese. And if you are in an Asian studies graduate program, you'll need Japanese as well, without which no decent place will give you a degree in Asian studies. So you're part of that conversation, and you are really talking a lot more with historians of China. You go to different conferences. If you work on the Russian-Soviet part of it, you are part of a different, you start with Russian, which is absolutely essential. You go to different conferences. It's funny that Russian, Soviet, Central Asia is not part of Asian studies. You end up going to either the Slavic studies conferences or Middle East studies conferences. And it's a different literature. So building bridges across those two historiographies was the biggest challenge. And at the beginning, I was not quite sure I'll be able to really integrate the two narratives. I think in the end, the way it turned out, it was I'm quite happy with that. I don't work with Chinese, but my access to Xinjiang is through Uyghur, which I do use. It's a Turkic language, very close to Uzbek. So that's my access to Xinjiang. I also had some research assistance from people who work with Chinese. So there are a few titles cited in Chinese that was really the work of research assistants. So I think that was the biggest challenge. There are other points I wanted to make, but those are not really a challenge. The challenge was to bring some coherence and bridge the gap between the two historiographies. Initially, I thought, I teach Central Asia, so writing this would be easy. I'll just type up my notes. And then it took 4 years, and there was time in the middle where I thought this will never end. It had just sprawled in all sorts of directions. So that was also a little bit of a challenge. But
in your book, you theorize that somehow the Silk Road, right? I mean, essentially the economy of the Silk Road, essentially the economy of the Central Asia was not based on the trade through Silk Road. It has its own existence, which was independent of Silk Road. So why is that? Why that viewpoint?
So, I mean, I'm borrowing this critique of the idea of the Silk Road from a number of other scholars. That I think today the Silk Road is often used as a crutch almost to talk about Central Asia. And the more you learn about Central Asia itself, the less useful the concept appears. I think at the beginning of the book, I talk about a little bit of the critique that the term Silk Road was first coined in 1877 by a German geographer who used it for a very specific purpose of tracking trade routes out of China. Since then, the term has just expanded and expanded and expanded. And on the one hand, it has become very Sinocentric. It's about, so if you look at all the books that are out there with Silk Road in their title, a lot of them are about China and China's relations with the West or with Europe. And at the very best, then Central Asia just becomes a way station in that story. So the Silk Road is really not about Central Asia. It's become more and more about China. And ultimately, I think the only useful thing about that term that I can see is as a metaphor for exchange. But beyond that, it can be used for, places on the dark web. It can be used for like everything and anything. The other point is that the East-West trade was not the most significant thing about Central Asia. That Central Asia's connections to India historically were far more significant than the Indian trade lasted into the early 20th century. And that for Central Asia was at least as significant as anything else. And in some ways, Central Asia connected Indian trade to Russia. And so that north-south axis is just as significant. But ultimately, my problem with the term is that it's imprecise and it is not concerned with Central Asia itself.
So a common perception about Central Asian countries is them being historically isolated from the rest of the world. However, that's not correct. As you describe in your book, it had influence from Islam, Mongols, Qing dynasty, Tsardom of Russia, whose cultural influence do we see the most in present-day Central Asia?
So in present-day Central Asia, I think I would say that it's not a single. I think all these influences are deeply intertwined. First of all, we cannot just pull out single strands you cannot just pull out a pure Islam out of there or pure Russian. But I would say that today the impact of the transformation of the 20th century is the most central thing about that, and especially in the in the 5 post-Soviet states, the Soviet past is absolutely still with us. And And I think the second to last chapter of my book is called "Are We Still Post-Soviet?" And the answer I give is largely in um, in the affirmative. And that is what makes those countries actually the 20th century trajectories of their history is what makes them quite different from, say, South Asia or Afghanistan or Iran and Turkey for that matter. So now, and then in Xinjiang, of course, which is passing through a very sad and tragic period in its history, again, the impact of the People's Republic of China is a defining feature of its present. But these influences are also, not static, right? So one of the arguments I make is that while Islam is absolutely there and it's been the dominant religion for the last 800 years or so in most of Central Asia, that what it means to people in Central Asia and the forms that it takes and how they relate to it has also undergone massive transformations.
Correct. So, how has the Treaty of Nerchinsk defined the history of the region?
Retrospectively, yes. At that time, I'm not sure the Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689, the people who were signing it actually knew what it would lead to, but we can see that as the beginning of what I call the enclosure of the steppe, when it starts being encircled by these sedentary land-based empires on its periphery. I think the Treaty of St. Petersburg in 1881 is perhaps, we can say much more clearly that was what really divided up Central Asia because that was a treaty when the Qing conquered Xinjiang a second time, and it was that treaty that really formalized the division and the boundary between these two empires that was then also subject to what had become international law in a way that in 1689 was not quite really the case. But yes, the Treaty of Nerchinsk, you begin to see the enclosure.
So, all the five Central Asian countries have a close relationship with Russia and China. Do the two countries act as counterbalance to each other in the region?
So it's very much a moving picture, and I think it depends a little bit on which country we are talking about. But China really has emerged as a major force in the region since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. China's presence in Central Asia was minimal, and post-Soviet Central Asia was minimal. Now it's a whole at a whole different level in both in terms of its economic weight and increasingly its military clout as well. In terms of counterbalance, I would say that yes, that both Russia and China are also wary of outside influences. The Chinese have made a fear of Islamic extremism almost into a state religion, but they're also wary of the United States, which had acquired bases in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan in the aftermath of 9/11. So it's that wariness that brings them together, takes the form of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where Russia and China find plenty of ways of cooperating. The Russians are wary of the rise of China. Central Asia has they invented the term "the near abroad" after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. In the 1990s, Russia was sort of on its knees in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It couldn't really do very much, and in some ways, that was the vacuum in which China moved in. But at the same time, there is no question that the links between Russia and Central Asia are of a different nature than the links of post-Soviet Central Asia with China. The cultural and the linguistic ties are there. Russian is still the most commonly used foreign language in Central Asia. The Central Asian labor migration, of which is quite substantial in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, when people go, they go to Russia. They don't go to the Gulf, as happens in South Asia. They don't, and they don't go to China. So those links are still very much there, and in that sense, the Russia-China divide is still from the Treaty of St. Petersburg, still there.
So Sinicization of Xinjiang is a reality. China
Absolutely.
has turned the entire province into a prison and is trying to dissect the people from their rich heritage. What designs does it have in Xinjiang?
It's I think ultimately, I think people have called what's going on cultural genocide. That if I think the maximum goal would be to turn Xinjiang into just simply another indistinguishable part of China. The official ideology has always been that China is a unified multinational state. But the emphasis has always been on the unified rather than the multinational. And the multinational basically means that the Uyghurs are Chinese, the same way that Han Chinese are Chinese. And in Mandarin, there is a difference between China and Han, but in actual practical reality, that difference is minimal, if not non-existent. 93% of the population of China is Han Chinese. And so when they talk about China being a nation state, it's really the nation state of the Han Chinese. And they have the demographic weight that they can transform the demography of all the non-Chinese regions of the People's Republic. This idea of that China is a single nation state actually goes back to the late Qing. And so about the turn of the 20th century, the Qings stopped thinking about themselves as an empire and began to think of themselves as a nation state, which means that the territory is fixed and inviolable. And that idea has persisted with all Chinese regimes, both the Qing, the nationalists, and then the communists. They have taken this single idea as a core value. And in that sense, I argue somewhere in my book that the Chinese Communist Party is essentially a nationalist party. That nationalism and communism have always been intertwined in the 20th century, and the Chinese Communist Party is sort of exhibit A for that claim. And so they have undertaken conscious policies of demographic transformation in the borderlands. Manchuria, which was where the Qing dynasty came from, they're Manchus, in the northeast has been settled with Han Chinese. So is Tibet and Inner Mongolia. And so is Xinjiang, that in 1949, the Han percentage of the population was about 5%. Today is 42, and this is not just accident. There are actual, policies that lead to that. So demographic transformation is one, but the other thing is that the lesson that the Chinese leadership seems to have learned from the collapse of the Soviet Union is that the Soviets gave the minorities too much power and they broke up the country. And so since 1991, Chinese policies towards its minorities have become ever more restricted. So they had borrowed at the time of the creation of the People's Republic, they had borrowed certain aspects of Soviet nationalities policies, which were about territorial autonomy and et cetera, but always from the beginning in a diluted form. So the Soviets had transformed the Russian Empire into a federal union. That never happened in China. China remains a unitary state, it's not a federation. The nationalities, the Minzu enjoy territorial autonomy. The phrase used to be, you are masters of your own home. But if the Soviets actually used the term self-determination, that was never used in China. And at the level of practice, the level of autonomy was always quite restrictive, much less than in the Soviet Union. And that has been curtailed since 1991 gradually. And there were practical consequences. What happened in the Soviet Union in the post-war period was that in all the republics, the national communist elites acquired a substantial amount of power within the Soviet system, and but also a great deal of self-confidence. And it was on the basis of that new kinds of national narratives and national consciousness sort of emerged. In Xinjiang, the cultural policies did produce a national imagination among the Uyghurs, but it was not accompanied by any level of political autonomy or the emergence of any political elites that would have anywhere remotely the kind of sway that Soviet Central Asian elites could have. So yes, ultimately, I think the goal of in China is to erase all differences, and there is a museum, the Kashgar City Museum in Kashgar. The last time I was there, it was under construction, or it had been shut down for good. I could not tell. But the time before that, it had an exhibition where Kashgar was the center of all sorts of networks connecting all of Eurasia. And there was nothing on the map that had any indication that it was an Uyghur city or it had anything to do with Xinjiang. It was just the center of Eurasia. A Chinese city at the center of Eurasia.
China also claims Pamir region of Tajikistan, which is about 45% landmass of Tajikistan. So, do they really have a claim to it, or it's just a part of their expansionist agenda?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how serious the Chinese are about that claim, but so at its most expansive, China can claim any territory that was ever claimed by the Qing. And usually they, in official discourse, they are a little more restrained, but there is an aspect of Chinese nationalism that basically says that all the lands ceded by the Qing to the Russians over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, when the balance of power between the two began to shift, and indeed all of Mongolia, for that matter, um, are Chinese territory. So this very bizarre switch between imperial expansion, the product of imperial expansion, done by a dynasty that was not ethnically Chinese. It was the Manchu Qing Empire that had rolled into Central Asia. That becomes the Qing emperors, the Manchu emperors become the great unifiers of the homeland, and then anything that they ever conquered can be claimed as Chinese. So once when they conquered Xinjiang in the 1750s, Qing armies kept rolling into what is now Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, and all sorts of people, took an oath of allegiance, which at that time really did not bind them to do anything, and did not really make them Chinese, the subjects of the Qing, let alone make them Chinese. But there are in the historical claims that can be made. Those can be seen as that half of Kazakhstan had become part of China because some Kazakh Khan took some oath in 1761, while he had also taken a similar oath to the Russian empress. So I think here we are talking about some sort of irredentism that I think there is a fairly chauvinistic and fairly radical Han Chinese nationalism that does exist, and in the Chinese language internet that is quite out there. Whether the Chinese state in its official capacity will make those claims is at least certainly not right now at the moment. It's not a very big thing, but who knows what might happen in another generation.
How much of a role did national identity play in the breakup of Soviet Russia?
So that is a very good question. I think, again, retrospectively, we can say it played a great deal, but what Gorbachev had set in motion was not a plan to break up the Soviet Union. That was a bit of an accident. He started as program of economic change, and the very first slogan when he began to shake things up was acceleration of the tempos of economic production. And then it turned out that, well, that could happen only through perestroika, restructuring, and then that led to glasnost, which was openness. And what that openness then turned into a program of political liberalization. And in some ways, that was the craziest thing, that you transform the economy and the political system at the same time. That attempt, the simultaneous reform, sort of brought about completely unforeseen transformations. The Chinese transformed their economy in a far more radical way than anything Gorbachev could ever have imagined. But there was absolutely no political liberalization that accompanied it. So that's the difference in the path of. But to answer your question, what that political liberalization then did was, when the Communist Party of the Soviet Union gave up its monopoly on political power, and et cetera, it turns out that the one language that really appealed was that of the nation. And that, I mean, this is the argument I make in my book, that while the Soviet Union existed, everyone outside, pretty much everyone outside the socialist camp, assumed that it was just Russia, that Russia and the Soviet Union were synonymous, that Soviet nationalities policies were just eyewash, and you could never be an Uzbek and a Soviet at the same time. And I think what we have learned since then, and this is a main argument in my book, that is just completely getting it backwards, that these national identities and national movements did pre-exist. They had come into existence before the revolution. But the Soviets, partly as a way of countering them, then created these republics, the idea of territorial autonomy, which they actually put into practice. And while the territorial autonomy did not amount to a great deal of control over the economy, it gave linguistic and cultural rights, and that allowed for the consolidation of these national identities in a particular way, and that the celebration of the nation was completely above board in this later Soviet period, and that's where the self-confident political elites in each republic were also then often tied, sometimes through friendship and even marriage, to these new intellectual and cultural elites that were there to celebrate the nation. And you could celebrate the nation, especially its great distant past. You could not rock the boat, and you could not claim independence. You could not say, we are better than the Russians, or so on and so forth. So you had to talk about the great friendship of peoples and the Russians' role in that. But beyond that, you could do all sorts of things with your celebrating the national past. And once this political liberalization began, the party itself had, by monopolizing the language of economic transformation and of class, it had monopolized that, and it had in many ways delegitimized that. The only way you could argue against the party was in the name of the nation, often in the name of a Leninist nationalities policy that had, the argument went, not been fully implemented. The argument was, we are supposed to be autonomous. We are not. We're supposed to be able to use our own language, and yet Russian is everywhere. So it's the non-fulfillment of the promise of what was called the Leninist nationalities policy that often underpinned the rise of these movements. But if in, say, Estonia, a national popular front sort of broke the shackles of the party in Central Asia and in many other places, in Belarus, in the Caucasus, is the party elite that then commandeered the language of the nation and reinvented themselves as national leaders. And it's that, so the personnel remained the same, but they completely switched the political language that they used. And so Nur Sultan Nazarbayev, who retired only 2 years ago, was a very clear link to the late Soviet period. He'd been in office since 1989 as the first secretary of the Communist Party of Kazakhstan. Or Islam Karimov, who died in 2016, had been in office since 1990. So that's the somewhat mixed bag of so that's how I would qualify the statement that nationalism broke the Soviet Union apart. That was the one kind of political language that was available, that was attractive and compelling to people.
The five countries have a shared history, and it is difficult to build a national identity when your history lies in the geographical boundaries of other nation states. How do these five countries manage it?
I'm sorry, could you, I missed the first part, sorry.
Yeah, sure. The five countries have a shared history, and it is
Mhm.
obviously difficult to build a national identity when your history lies within the geographical boundaries of other countries. So, how do these five countries manage it?
Well, in some ways, they don't. I mean, they have a shared history, but I think one of the arguments I make is that we should not think of the shared history as completely homogeneous and undifferentiated. That there was always a big a big difference between the nomadic and the agrarian and sedentary populations of Central Asia, and they were, of course, semi-nomads and all of that as well. So um, the idea of the nation really arrives in Central Asia at the end of the 20th century, and there were always sort of multiple projects that coexisted. So the Kazakhs had really for them the big thing was that their land was being settled by Russians, and there was the land question was absolutely central. And the idea of uniting all Kazakhs into one territorial entity was what drove them. The Uzbek idea was quite different. It was centered on the cities, and it looked back to the empires of Central Asia, especially those of Timur, as the starting point of the of the Uzbek nation. Then, over the course of the Soviet period, one of the things was that these five countries, especially these five nations, and you can also throw in the Karakalpaks uh, as well, began to imagine their histories as not really all that interconnected. So the national narratives today are all equally teleological in the sense that they all end in the triumph of the nation with independence in 1991, but they also divide up the past. And they'll say, here's the Kyrgyz people, here's the Kazakh people projected all the way into the past, which to a historian is quite problematic, but that is how these historiographies are written. They all underpin the legitimacy of the post-Soviet nation states. And so in that sense, the history has been cut up by Central Asians. And there's been, so all of that is also interesting because there is this a whole narrative out there that was took shape during the Cold War, and we cannot shake it off. That's these states are artificial. They're created by the Soviets as an act of divide and conquer. And why did the Soviets need to divide and conquer? Because there was some innate unity in Central Asia that they were afraid of. And that's really a problematic set of assumptions, because if you look at the history of Central Asia, there is, to say that there's a shared culture does not mean that there was, always or ever any unity of any sort. So this, but there is this holy grail of Central Asian unity that was destroyed by the Soviets. That we sort of always hanker after. When the Soviet Union fell apart, uh, people in Turkey thought that, oh, this is just one big Turkic area. We can just step in and bring them together. None of that really happened. If anything, it's the relations between the five countries are a little too fraught, and there have been really no regional forums that so you have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but that includes Russia and China, and now India and Pakistan as well. So it's not really a regional regional organization. I mean, even in South Asia, with all the craziness, you have SARC that limps along somehow. You don't even have something like that in Central Asia. So the unity part is a little bit. I mean, if anything, one wishes that they got along a little bit better, but those state borders have become all too real. With visa regimes and everything, and exchange controls, and so Central Asia is actually, more divided now than it was in the Soviet period.
I mean, if you look at all these countries, it seems that they still run as mini Soviet unions in themselves, because the political suppression, the independence is still not there. They truly don't function as a democracy. All of them are essentially just ruled by one leader who is there for the eternity until he decides to retire or he dies.
Only one has decided to retire, otherwise they all die.
Yeah. So I mean, what do you see? I mean, where is this going? I mean, what lies for all these five countries?
As a historian, I'm much happier talking about the past than the future. But I would say that, yeah, this is an example of, again, the Soviet heritage that is really quite significant. And again, here, when the Soviet Union fell apart, there was this unstated assumption that the post-Soviet world would be like capitalist and liberal democratic, just like us, whatever that meant. And there's a whole literature in political science about transition. So transition from state socialism to something, and that was transition to a known destination, and that has really just the problem with the transitology. This is what its critics called it. The was the assumption that they're all moving in this one direction, and that sort of Francis Fukuyama with his end of history and all of that the whole world would be capitalist and liberal democratic, and that's just not the assumption there, that these places own past and own history and own circumstances count for nothing has not been borne out. On the other hand, while these states are all authoritarian to various degrees and all have single leaders, and I mean, Kyrgyzstan has had two uprisings that have toppled presidents, but they do exist in a world that is quite different than in the Soviet Union. And in that, now they exist in a neoliberal global order, which actually makes corruption and authoritarianism possible at a level that in the Soviet Union was not quite possible. If you made money on the side, or if you're corrupt, you could stuff your banknotes in a mattress, or you could go buy blue jeans on the black market or something like that. Now you can stash that money away in Swiss bank accounts at the Cayman Islands, or buy property in London or Geneva. So, in that sense, the context in which these states exist is actually quite different than the Soviet. And if anything, the argument here is that it's this internationalization and globalization that actually enables a lot of this authoritarianism. And it provides, opportunities for levels of corruption that are actually greater than they were in the Soviet Union.
So what projects are you currently working on?
Right now, I am not working. I'm taking a little break. The pandemic means that you can't actually go anywhere. But so I've been stuck here at home for, been on a plane once in the last 2 years. And so what can you do in those circumstances? But no, more seriously, I have, so this was a big global history of 2.5 centuries. But historians do different kinds of, write different kinds of books. And so Making Uzbekistan, the last book that I did, deals with 15 years, and it's based on archival research, not so much of a synthesis of the whole literature. And there are a lot of threads in there that I did not go into the book. And there are parts of that history of the 1920s, Central Asia, and the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution that I find quite fascinating. And there are things there that I might like to go back to there. So for about 3 years, Tashkent was sort of a crossroads of revolutionaries from all over the place. There were Iranians, and there were Turks, and there were hundreds, if not thousands, of Indians. They're called Indian revolutionaries, and who were there in the hope of overthrowing British rule in India through somehow getting Soviet help. And so what did revolution mean to these people? What did independence mean to these people? Just trying to figure out some of those things is sort of been a hobby of mine for a long time. I keep collecting materials about them. They're not all that plentiful. There are a few memoirs that the traces in the Soviet archives are quite thin, but that's something I would like to go back to if and when travel and the archives open up again.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for discussing your book with us. And yeah, it was a pleasure speaking with you. We wish you best for all your future work.
Well, it was a pleasure. I mean, I love talking about my book, so if you give me the opportunity. So thank you. It was a great pleasure.
Sure. So before we still have 2 minutes left. So actually, just because we have started this YouTube channel, so just wanted to understand. Do you have any feedback for us? How has been your interaction with us? What do you like the format, or is there any suggestion for us so that we can improve?
No, the questions were great, and I think the less scripted and the less formal the conversation is, the better it flows. So no, this was great. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye. Namaste.
Namaste.
Hopefully you liked this episode. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.